Well, I have to tell you guys, I'm a little surprised because the ongoing joke in Churches of Christ is, there's Pastor Appreciation Day, but in Churches of Christ we call it October. So that is the first time anyone has ever honored us on Pastor Appreciation Day, so it means a lot. You guys' support and encouragement, it just means the world to me and propels me on to do what I do. So let me ask you this. Why do kids, as you're putting them to sleep, all of a sudden get so much energy? Have you ever had this as a parent? Like, you work all day to wear them out, right? You've been doing all these things, and they're starting to get crabby, and you know it's time to get ready for bed. You go through the battle of putting the PJs on, brushing their teeth, laying down with them, and then you get to that moment, and it's like someone snuck caffeine in their system. They got all this, and they're bouncing off the walls, they're chatting, they're going on and on. They're like, what am I going to do with them? So a few months ago, I was having one of these nights with Silas, and finally, I got him calmed down. I'm like, okay, this is it. He's going to fall asleep. And right as he got still, all of a sudden he popped up and he goes, you know what, Daddy? I know what you need to preach on. And I'm like, oh, great. Here's my 7-year-old son telling me how to do my job. What do I need to preach on? So I say, okay, Silas, what is it? What do I need to preach on? This ought to be good, right? He goes, well, Daddy, you need to preach on the book of Ruth. I said, okay, tell me more. Why the book of Ruth? And Silas says, well, it's a good story. The church needs to hear that story. And I said, you know what? I replied back to him, Ruth is the best daughter-in-law of all time. The church needs to hear that story. But Silas, I was preparing after we finished this series on James to preach about Daniel. And he goes, oh, Daniel, that is my favorite story of all time. So this week, I am preaching Silas's favorite story in the Bible. He's here for the first time to listen to Daddy's sermons, first time ever. And next week is his second favorite story in the Bible. I don't know if he'll be up to that or not. But this brings me up to us Buicks, us brought up in church kids. This is also the topic of the best VeggieTales of all time, which we watched last night. Just to reminisce, a very good VeggieTales episode where it features Rack, Shack, and Benny. And there's a greedy CEO boss who will do anything for the bunny, which is meant to rhyme with something else, which brings us to power-hungry leaders. However, have you ever noticed how much power-hungry leaders demand of our worship? From CEOs to politicians, they all want us to praise and honor them for being so amazing. We can think about kings throughout the ages who have demanded total worship. One year on Hitler's birthday, April 20th, 1938, as a tribute, his prisoners were ordered to wave swastika flags honoring him on his birthday. In the heyday of Stalin, a providential meeting was taking place when Stalin's name was mentioned, and immediately everyone jumped up to praise and hail Stalin as quickly as they could. In fact, Stalin used to send KGB agents out to churches just to keep an eye on them, to see what they were doing, to see who they were worshiping. And all these things come from an unchecked ego. An ego that makes us think over time, if we allow it to continue to go unchecked, to think that we're in fact a God. But before we get into that, I have to share with you what I've been up to this week. So a few months ago, I got invited to be part of a program I always wanted to be a part of. It's called CMI, Contemplative Ministers Initiative. It started about 7 or 8 years ago. And here's the deal. Some ACU professors realized a lot of preachers were burning out. And they decided to do something about it. In fact, I was having dinner last week with Carson Reed, this week I should say. Carson Reed is the dean of the Bible department at ACU. He's also a big fan of the restaurant Amica's, which we all know and love. Carson Reed says they have 200 churches of Christ across the country looking for a minister, and they don't have a single name of a minister to give them. That's where we're sitting at right now. Okay, so they're like, We need to recruit some more ministers. They're doing some things, some lay ministers, that kind of stuff. But we also need to keep what we have. And so the mission of this program, as some of you are reading ahead, is to help ministers to be a calm, non-reactive, spiritually centered, prayerful presence in their churches. We believe all ministries begin with the minister's deep relationship with Christ. So it's a 2-year commitment. I will go down for a total of 4 times. I have gone once now. And there's some that have already gone. This was their 3rd time. And then I was in this new group that are from all churches all over the nation. About 20 Church of Christ preachers and 1 Christian church guy from Lakewood were there at this. And some of them come from the most influential churches of Christ in the country, but most of them come from small churches just like ours. Church in Salt Lake City, a church in Angel Fire. The preacher in Angel Fire comes to Monarch to ski every winter. If you want to know who has the good snow, I think he said, no, we just go there to get away. I'm like, and the snow's better. Oregon, Idaho, the guy in Idaho preaches at 2 churches of Christ, 20 miles apart, 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening. People can't get mad because if they go to the Church of Christ next door, he's preaching at both of them, right? He's cornered the market. It's a great idea. So, but it was a great, encouraging time. And by the way, I got a chance to brag on all of you about how great you all are, this congregation is. Get this, almost all of them, between about the 10 professors and that are teaching us and the 20 ministers, almost all of them had been to Salida either on trek or on vacation. Wow. And guess how many of them knew our church existed? So yeah, sounds like what's going on in our community as well. You know, we're tucked away in this neighborhood. We don't have any signs. No one knows we're here. I understand what's going on there. So it was good to get us on the map a little bit. So in this program, we're learning a lot of different things. How to handle difficult situations like potlucks was one of the examples. How to express ourselves, how to understand our personalities, our strengths, our weaknesses. We looked at all types of prayer and not just praying petitions, but how to sit and listen to God in our prayers. We spent a few hours one day talking about our weekly schedule and our rhythms and making sure that our spiritual practices are going well, we're having good rhythms. And I could go on and on and on. And remember, this is just the start of what I'll be going through. But get this, it costs our church nothing. They have an endowment that covers all of this for all the churches. It is a benefit of their ministry, and they have raised the funds because they believe it's so important. So thank you for all allowing me to share with you what I've been up to this week as I work on myself and my spiritual life, and you know, as well as pouring into all of you. So let's go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, as we open up our Bibles today, I ask for your Spirit to come. For your Spirit to come and show us the ways we need to live our faith boldly. May we learn from generations of the past who have gone before this. But when we read this story, God, may we see your story. And may it give our hearts faith to see your story and our story. Pour through me the gift of preaching that Christ may be formed in hearts. It's in your name that I pray. Amen. Okay, so last week we watched God work through Daniel's prayer and revealing visions and dreams. And because of that, King Nebuchadnezzar praises the God of Daniel for it. And then we're going to see a change this week. Now, we don't know how much time goes on between chapter 2 and chapter 3. Some scholars think about 20 years has gone by. We don't know. There's been a distance of time. But here's what I do know. It doesn't take us 20 seconds sometimes to stop thinking about God and to start thinking about ourselves. And that is what King Nebuchadnezzar has done. He is thinking of himself. Last week he had a dream of a golden head and a statue, and that was his kingdom. And he's like, that's a good idea, but let's just not add the golden head. Let's add an entire body made of gold. Let's add on to this. Let's do something with this. And so here is what happens as we open up and start in Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Duran in the province of Babylon. He gave the summoner, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the other providential officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So he sees this huge image, and it's a Texas-size image we're talking about. And when anyone makes a statue, it's just, statues can be kind of self-promoting. It's a little interesting, right? So this thing is 90 feet high by 9 feet wide. Interestingly enough, there is not enough gold in all of Babylon to make this statue. So the inside is carved of wood and the outside is lined with gold to have this set up here for them to come and worship. So throughout the chapter, if you read it through on your own, you'll see all these different officials coming, and it's just a fancy way of telling us everyone working in government had to come. They had to come, and they had to come worship King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, anyone who's worked in politics or watched an inauguration or something knows what this is like, right? We get letters in the mail now telling us how good our presidents and governors are and those kind of things. It's this promotion thing. Like, hey, look how great this guy is. It's both political and spiritual in nature. Nebuchadnezzar, like many kings, is starting to believe he's a god. He's getting a little too full of himself, so everyone has to pay respect to him. Now, they worship many gods at this time. They were accustomed to worshiping many gods. So what is it just to show up and just pinch a little incense, bow, worship this God? I mean, it's something, if we're honest, that we're all too familiar with, a temptation we all too often face. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down before and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So there's a choice. Worship or be thrown into a fiery furnace. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this furnace. This furnace is the smelting machine used to refine metals, probably like the gold that was used to make this statue. It had an opening on the top where the smoke could come out, where you could throw wood in, and where you could also throw in ore as they refined and smelted in this process. At the bottom would have been a drawer, maybe kind of like on our wood stoves, where you would pull out the ashes, but that's where they would pull out the refined metals. On the side, it had openings where they could check in and see how the smelting was going, but they could also use it with the billows to pour in air to really pump up the fire and make it even more hot and increase the heat. Now, it was a huge furnace, big enough for several people to both stand in and walk around in. And I imagine growing up it looking something like this furnace from Indiana Jones. Do you remember this thing? This is what kept me up at night as a child, right? This is what I imagine if you do not worship the idol you are going down into. And anyone who's watched Indiana Jones knows how terrifying that is. So to go in here is certain death. But there's something else. There's a bigger problem. Because the bigger problem is to bow down and to worship this idol is to break the very first of the 10 commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. And so I want to list the pressures that these three are under, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because I think we can relate to these pressures. The first kind of pressure they are under is the pressure of authority. The king has said something. He has made an edict. He has given them this law. And sometimes there is a boss, a president, or a law that goes into place that goes against our faith. And when that happens in those moments, we have a decision to make. The second type of pressure is that of conformity. Well, everyone else is bowing, all the other officials are, so shouldn't we as well? Now, make no mistake here, this is the pressure we face most often, the greatest type of pressure we face. We tell our kids, what, if everyone else was going to jump off a cliff, would you do it? But here's the hard question. Do our lives look different than any of the non-Christians around us? Do we live in different neighborhoods? Do we drive different cars? Do we take different kinds of vacations? Or do we act differently at all than the world around us? The third kind of pressure is intimidations. Few things are as intimidating as a fiery furnace. That's up there on the list, but it can be intimidating to lose a friend because of your faith, to lose a customer because of your faith, to lose a promotion because of your faith decision. And then there's a fourth type of intimidation that we see in verse 12. But there are some Jews among you, astrologers go on to say, whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. The final pressure they face is that of malice. Their contemporaries have turned them in to the king. I'm thinking they had been looking for a while. They're jealous of the power of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they've been looking for an opportunity, and this is it. They say in life that snitches get stitches. But here they're hoping to get a promotion. If they can get rid of these three, there's some people, some officials waiting in the wings to take their position. And so there's something inside of us that knows when we're about the world during the week that people know about our Christian faith. And they're waiting for us to fail, to either put us down or to say, oh, look at those Christians, what a bunch of hypocrites. So how will they respond to this pressure? That is what we need to learn. But first, let's look at King Nebuchadnezzar. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the larp, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hands? King Nebuchadnezzar is furious. But we see how important these three men are. Because the edict was, you will be thrown in there immediately. Well, he finds out about it and he's like, okay, I know I told you not to do that, but I'm going to give you a second chance. Here's the deal, you really need to do this. And there's a key line right here, the key line for the whole chapter. But what God? I mean, what God has the power to save you three from my hands? What God could do this? It must have been a terrifying moment. I don't know which one of them spoke up or if they spoke together, but here's what they said. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves from you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. To Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the decision has already been made. There is no debate about this. We are not going to do this. They feel no need to defend themselves or defend God before the king. They simply refuse to do this. In fact, they would rather die than to worship this idol. And it makes me think of the TV show, What Would You Do? You remember those TV shows, the social experiments, where you sit out there, they got a camera in the back, and they put people in these awkward situations just to see how people respond? It makes me think, what would we do? What would we do if we were in that situation? Would we come up with excuses? I mean, it's just a meaningless idol. It's fake. We know there's nothing to it. It's okay to just bow to it. Would we rationalize it? I need to stay in my position. I need to keep my power. I need to keep my authority so that way I can look over the other Jews. Would we count on God's mercy and beg for forgiveness after the fact? See, deep down, we know how easy these practices are when the idols come. We know how easily we can bow to the idols of consumerism or the lust of our hearts or the desires of our flesh, how easily we can put our desire to run the world over God's desire and plan to run the world. But these three knew better. They knew better because they not only knew their Bibles, but they believed their Bibles. See, a generation before them, Habakkuk had warned them of this very moment. It says this, "Of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it trusts in his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to the wood, 'Come to life,' or the lifeless stone, 'Wake up.' Can it give guidance? It is covered with gold and silver, and there is no breath in it." And this is the contrast. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. Do you know that Daniel 3 actually reads as a Jewish comedy? When the early Jews would read this, they would laugh at this kind of thing, because here's what it sounds like. What kind of a joke is it to believe that this wooden statue that you carved, that you lined with gold, was a deity? How funny is that? What kind of a joke is it? This is why they list off all the instruments, that all these instruments would make all these loud noises, but the image can't talk itself. It doesn't have the breath of life in it. How laughable is it to parade all these government officials before this image and do something? Instead, these three Jewish men believed there was another way to do things. In the world, there was a God who was working, and the best thing to do was to sit in silence and watch and wait for this God to work. That was their plan. Here's the consequences of their plan. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of his strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men were wearing their robes, their trousers, their turbans, and other clothes, and were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. All seems to be lost. The king does what kings do. How do you get rid of problems? You destroy problems. You execute problems. And even the soldiers, the best soldiers of Babylon, died in this process of getting rid of these 3 Jewish boys. But here's what happens next. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement, and he asked the advisors, "Weren't there 3 men tied up and thrown into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, Your Majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. King Nebuchadnezzar, with his own 2 eyes, witnessed the most amazing thing, that there was another in the fire. He has to confirm what he is seeing with his officials because it is so outlandish. No ordinary person could do this. The king declares him to be a son of the gods. And so, Silas, this is where I need your help. Tell us all loudly, who was in that fire? Jesus was in that fire. Theologians talk about this. They have debates about it. But here is who I believe was in that fire. I believe it was Jesus. I believe it was a pre-incarnated version appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament just for this specific purpose. And here's what I need you to see. When did Jesus show up? In the fire. How often do we pray to God, take the obstacle away, keep me out of the fire, keep me out of the furnace, keep the storms at bay, prevent the pain, the hardship, the obstacle. But when does God seem to do his best work? In the fire. In the fires and the storms and the struggles of life. Isaiah warned of this very moment when Isaiah said this, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and when you pass through the rivers, they shall not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames, they will not set you ablaze. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. Your Savior is what he says to them. That is the warning. See, Daniel 3 is comfort. It's comfort, but it is not a guarantee. But it shows us how God works for those that he loves, those who have been called according to his purpose. This is not a token story. It is a blueprint for how God works in our lives. In certain times, in certain fires, our God walks through with us through those seasons of life. Christ usually doesn't keep us out of the furnaces of life, but he has a knack for finding us in them. He doesn't shield us from the distresses and dangers in this world, but in the struggle, the fourth man comes and walks alongside of us like he's on the road to Emmaus. The shepherd has a way of finding his sheep. So may faith grow in your heart because of this and because of this declaration. Then King Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angels and rescued his servants. They have trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." The king goes on to say that if anyone messes with the God of Israel, messes with the God of these three, that they will be cut to pieces and their houses will be turned into rubble. Okay, kind of extreme, King Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe you didn't need to go that far. But King Nebuchadnezzar, if you read the end of the chapter, gives this amazing statement of faith. For no other God can save in this way. No other God can save in this way. And for the third week in a row, we see them getting promoted even higher in the kingdom because of their faith. An incredible story. But there's a better part. The best part comes from 6 words. 6 words that say, but even if he doesn't. But even if he does not, faith's finest hour stands tall against all the forces the modern world at that time had to offer and says, but if not. Sometimes our prayers kind of sound more like a negotiation with God. Like, God, if you will behave this way, and if I behave this way, will you do something for me, is what we say. We make promises with God in hopes of persuading God to heal us or to change our circumstances. And let's be honest, not everyone receives the miracle. that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego received. But all, I believe, who call on the name of the Lord receive God's strength through their fires in life. But 3 Hebrew men, Rak, Shach, and Benny, believed that God could deliver them. But even if God didn't, they could still trust God. You see, faith does not predict God's ways, but holds to God's word. Faith obeys God instead of trying to change God's direction. Faith is not required to plot God's course, but it is to look at God's commands. The story is an example of how faith should operate in our lives. So the question is, can we have the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and say, but even if not, but even if not. At a providential meeting in the Soviet Union, an elderly man was unable to stand any longer. He had to take his seat. They noted who he was, and the next day they arrested him. He didn't bow and worship the idol long enough. On Hitler's birthday in 1938, the guards observed one man refusing to wave the swastika flag. They beat him and whipped him ruthlessly for it. But my favorite story of all comes from a little old church lady. The KGB had been out watching churches, keeping an eye on them. They wanted to see what her church was doing and saying, and this KGB agent was struck by her faith. The devotion of this older woman who is kissing the feet of a life-size cross during the worship service. The agent asked her afterwards, "Grandmother, are you prepared to kiss the feet of the beloved General Secretary of our great Communist Party?" She found herself trapped having to bow to the idol. And this old grandma had one of the most brilliant statements ever. She said, "Why, of course not. But you'd have to crucify him first." Ultimately, Daniel chapter 3 is about worship. What will we worship in our lives? The question from the past echoes into the present, and as we look forward into the future, even if God doesn't reverse the declines of Christianity around us, will we still worship him? Even if the pressure of conformity, authority, intimidation, and malice pushes us on all sides, will we still stand firm? Or maybe the harder question is, if the leaves are changing, will we still make time to worship God? If the elk are bugling, will we still make it a priority? If there's powder on the mountain, if the skies are clear for hiking, if the river's full of water, will we still worship? But may we live a life of worship that refuses to bow down to any other God but our God.